Welcome. Tonight, we begin not with a beginning, but with an ending. Or rather, with many endings. History is filled with grand exits, some tragic, some ironic, some so strange they feel like fables. But have you ever wondered, what makes a death truly epic? Is it the way a person faces it? The irony that surrounds it? Or the story that lingers long after they are gone? Let me ask you this. What would you do if you had spent years making yourself immune to every poison known to man, only to find that when you needed death the most, it refused to come? Or imagine winning a battle so completely that you tie your enemy's severed head to your saddle, only to be killed by a single tooth on the ride home. These are not myths. These are the real final chapters of kings, philosophers, inventors, and warriors who left the world in ways no one could have predicted. If you are ready to hear how some of history's most fascinating figures met their end, and why their stories still echo today, then stay with me. And if you enjoy exploring the quieter, stranger corners of the past, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Little Historical. It helps this small channel continue to bring you stories that deserve to be remembered. Now, settle in. Let us turn the pages together. He was a king who feared death so completely that he spent his entire life trying to outrun it. Mithridates VI, ruler of Pontus in the 1st century before Christ, lived in an age where poison was the weapon of choice for those who wanted power without the mess of a battlefield. Every meal could be his last. Every toast, a possible farewell. And so he did something extraordinary. He began to dose himself with small amounts of every toxin known to his court physicians. Hemlock, arsenic, nightshade, snake venom. A pinch today, a taste tomorrow. Over the years, his body transformed. What would kill an ordinary man barely registered with him. He built an immunity so complete that when his personal apothecaries crafted the legendary Mithridatum, a cure-all said to protect against any poison, they were simply bottling what he had already become. A king who had turned his own flesh into armor against the quietest death. But fate has a way of laughing at the well-prepared. Rome came for Pontus, and after years of war, Mithridates found himself cornered, betrayed by his own son, surrounded by enemies who wanted him alive only to parade him in chains through the streets of their city. He had always known this moment might come. So he reached for the poison he kept hidden in the hilt of his sword, the final escape route he had prepared decades ago. He swallowed. And waited. Nothing. Not a flicker. Not a tremor. After all those years of protecting himself against assassination, he had become immune to the very death he had chosen for himself. Imagine that for a moment. A man so afraid of dying that he built an unbreakable shield against every form of poison imaginable, only to find that when he needed that poison most, it had no power over him. The Romans were at the gates. He could hear them now. Shouting, breaking through. And so the king who had outsmarted assassins, outlived rivals, and turned his own body into a fortress did something far less elegant. He turned to one of his remaining guards, a mercenary who had followed him through years of war, and asked for the simplest death of all. A sword. No poison. No ceremony. Just the cold steel that any common soldier could provide. And in that moment, the man who had spent his life outrunning death met it in the most ordinary way possible, stabbed like any other man who stayed too long at a losing table. There is something almost cruel in the poetry of it. Mithridates had prepared for everything except the one thing that actually worked. And as he fell, you have to wonder if his last thought was not of his kingdom, not of Rome, but of all those years he spent drinking death in small doses, never realizing that the only poison he could not protect himself against was the one called pride. But his story does not end here. Because across the cold seas, in the windswept islands of the north, another warrior was about to learn that sometimes death comes not from the enemy you face, but from the trophy you carry home. But his story does not end here. Because across the cold seas, in the windswept islands of the north, another warrior was about to learn that sometimes death comes not from the enemy you face, but from the trophy you carry home. Sigurd the Mighty ruled the Orkney Islands in the 9th century, a Norse earl whose name was carved into the land by sword and sail. He was a man who understood victory, who had led his longships through storms and his warriors through shield walls without ever once doubting his place in the world. His rival was a Scottish noble named Maelbrigta, a man with a famously prominent tooth, a detail that seemed unimportant until the day Sigurd challenged him to a battle. 40 men each, they agreed. But Sigurd, who had never been one to let fairness stand in the way of triumph, brought 80. The slaughter was absolute. When the last of Maelbrigt's warriors fell, Sigurd did something that would have seemed like a boastful gesture, a declaration of absolute dominance. He cut off his enemy's head and tied it to his saddle, a trophy to display as he rode home through the countryside he now owned completely. The head bounced against the horse's flank with every stride. And as Sigurd rode, feeling the cold wind on his face and the weight of victory settling into his bones, one of Maelbrigt's teeth, that famously large tooth, scraped against his leg. A scratch. A thing so small it would have gone unnoticed in any other moment. But the 9th century had no medicine for what happened next. The wound festered, turning red, then swollen, then black. Within days, the earl who had conquered his enemy, who had brought 80 men to a fight meant for 40, who had tied a dead man's head to his horse as a trophy, lay in his hall, burning with fever. He had survived battles, storms, betrayals. He had never lost. And yet, as his skin grew hot and his breath grew shallow, he must have realized the terrible, absurd truth. He was not dying from a rival's sword. He was dying from a dead man's tooth. A scratch delivered not by an army, but by a head he had already defeated. The wound that killed him was not a wound of war. It was a wound of arrogance, a reminder that victory is never as clean as we pretend, and that the trophies we carry can sometimes carry something back. When Sigurd finally closed his eyes, he left behind a saga that would be told for centuries, not for his conquests, but for the irony of his end. Maelbrigte had not won the battle, but in the end, he had the last word. And as the Norse earl's body was laid to rest, one could almost imagine the ghost of his enemy, smiling with that famous tooth, satisfied that even in defeat, he had found a way to bite back. But from the cold north, we now turn to a battlefield of a very different kind, where a king would learn that victory itself can be a kind of poison, and that the cost of winning can sometimes be everything you have left. But from the cold north, we now turn to a battlefield of a very different kind, where a king would learn that victory itself can be a kind of poison, and that the cost of winning can sometimes be everything you have left. Pyrrhus of Epirus was a king who should have been remembered only for his brilliance. A cousin of Alexander the Great, he commanded armies with a ferocity that made Rome itself tremble. He was the kind of general who could look at a battlefield and see not chaos, but geometry. He knew where to place his elephants, when to commit his cavalry, how to break a legion's formation before the first spear was thrown. And yet, his name has survived not for his victories, but for what those victories cost him. The phrase Pyrrhic victory entered the language because of battles like Heraclea and Asculum, where he defeated the Romans so completely that his own army was left shattered, unable to continue the war. After one such triumph, he reportedly said, "One more such victory, and I am undone." He had won, but winning had taken everything. Years passed. The wars ground on. And in the end, it was not a Roman legion that brought him down, but a Greek city called Argos, a messy, chaotic fight that began in darkness and ended in the most undignified way imaginable. Pyrrhus entered the city at night, hoping to take it by surprise, but his soldiers became lost in the narrow streets. His elephants, those towering beasts that had once terrified Roman lines, became wedged between buildings, panicking in the confusion. What should have been a swift victory turned into a brawl, a street fight where no one could see clearly and no one could hear orders over the screaming. And in that chaos, a single elderly woman watched from her rooftop. We do not know her name. We do not know if she had lost sons to war, if she had seen her city besieged before, or if she was simply a grandmother who had had enough of kings bringing violence to her doorstep. But we know what she did. She picked up a heavy roof tile, one of those thick ceramic shingles meant to keep the rain out, and she threw it. The tile struck Pyrrhus directly on the head. A king who had faced the full might of Rome, who had commanded armies that shook the earth, who had won victories so costly they became a warning to every general who followed, was knocked from his horse by a piece of architecture thrown by a woman whose name history did not bother to record. He fell to the ground, dazed, vulnerable, and in that moment, a common soldier, one of the enemy, ran forward and finished what the tile had begun. There is a kind of poetry in this that feels almost cruel. Pyrrhus had survived battles that killed thousands. He had outmaneuvered the greatest military machine the world had ever seen. And yet, in the end, he was undone by gravity, a roof, and a woman who had simply decided she would not let another invader walk her streets unchallenged. His body was treated with respect, his enemies acknowledging the greatness of the man they had killed by accident, almost by coincidence. But the story that lingered was not of his brilliance. It was of the tile. Of the ordinary death that found an extraordinary man when all his luck finally ran out. He had won so many victories. He just never learned that some defeats come dressed as triumphs, and that the greatest generals are never safe from the smallest stones. From this alley in Argos, we now move to a palace in Russia, where a man would prove that some deaths require far more than a single falling tile to finish what fate has begun. From this alley in Argos, we now move to a palace in Russia, where a man would prove that some deaths require far more than a single falling tile to finish what fate has begun. Grigory Rasputin was never meant to be remembered. He was a peasant from Siberia, a wandering mystic with wild eyes and a reputation that followed him like smoke. And yet, by the winter of 1916, he had become the most powerful man in Russia, not because he sought power, but because the Tsarina, desperate to save her hemophiliac son, believed he alone could stop the bleeding. He came to the palace as a healer and stayed as something far more dangerous. A whisper in the ear of the empress. A shadow behind the throne. The nobility watched as this bearded peasant, with his rumpled clothes and unsettling gaze, accumulated influence they had spent generations chasing. And so they decided, in the way that powerful men have always decided such things, that Rasputin had to die. They invited him to a palace on the Moika River, a place of marble floors and gilded ceilings, and there they prepared a feast. But the cakes were laced with enough cyanide to kill a dozen men. Rasputin ate. He ate the cakes, drank the wine, and showed no effect. The conspirators watched in growing horror as the mystic smiled, asked for more, and seemed, if anything, more animated than before. So they shot him. Once. He fell. And as they leaned in to confirm the deed, his eyes opened. He rose, lunging at them, and they shot him again. Twice. 3 times. He collapsed, bleeding into the carpet, but still not still. They beat him. They cursed him. And still, he moved. By the time they bound his hands and dragged him to the frozen Neva River, the men who had set out to commit a simple murder had become something else entirely, desperate men who no longer understood what it was they were trying to kill. They pushed him through a hole in the ice, watching as the dark water swallowed him, and they told themselves it was over. But when his body was found days later, his hands were raised, clawing at the ice from below. The autopsy would later show that he had drowned. That poison, gunfire, and blunt force had not been enough, that even as the cold water filled his lungs, he had fought, had tried to pull himself back into the world of the living. He died, finally, not because their weapons were sufficient, but because the river was patient and the ice was strong. There is something almost supernatural in the way Rasputin refused to go quietly. He was not a saint, not a martyr, not even a particularly good man. But when death came for him, it had to work for every inch. And in that refusal, he became something that outlasted the empire he had helped destabilize. A story. A warning. A reminder that some men, for reasons no one can quite explain, seem to be made of something that ordinary death cannot easily claim. And yet, even Rasputin's story, extraordinary as it is not the strangest on our list tonight. Because from the frozen rivers of Russia, we now turn to ancient Greece, where a philosopher would prove that laughter can be just as deadly as any poison, and that the mind, for all its brilliance, is no match for a donkey eating figs.